Lord Lieutenant, my lords, ladies, Minister, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Iain Carlisle. On behalf of the Grand Orange Lodge, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to our event this evening in the historic surroundings of Riddel Hall. As the United States prepares to celebrate its 250th anniversary of independence, many organisations in Northern Ireland are taking the opportunity to highlight the numerous, very tangible links between our homeland and what would in time become the United States of America. And it is indeed a rich and impressive history. From pioneers to presidents, innovators and inventors, astronauts even, great military leaders and much more. But what many might ask, has it got to do with the Orange Order, an organisation formed a mere 231 years ago? As an institution which remembers and cherishes the glorious revolution of 1688, which was secured militarily here in Ireland, and its principles of liberty over tyranny, limited monarchy, constitutional democracy and political transparency, we in fact have a lot more in common with the Founding Fathers than people may think. Much of the political thought contained in King William III's Declaration and the subsequent Bill of Rights would later become important central principles for those shaping the foundational documents of the United States less than 90 years later. That legacy has been somewhat overlooked, but we hope that events like this will foster a better understanding of the interconnections between these two historic periods of time. This event has been made possible with financial support from the Department for Communities under their USA NI 250 programme, and we're delighted that Minister Lyons is in attendance, and I would now invite the Minister to speak. Thank you, Gordon.
Thank you very much, Lord Lieutenant, Lords, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for taking the time to come here this evening as we gather to explore a chain of ideas that stretches across more than 3 centuries and 3,000 miles of ocean. It's a story that connects the principles embedded in the aftermath of one revolution to the declaration that launched another. When King William crossed the Irish Sea in 1690, what followed was more than a change of monarch. The Glorious Revolution produced something new in the world, a constitutional settlement that placed firm limits on the power of the Crown, asserted the rights of Parliament, and crucially, planted the principle that government derives its authority from the consent of the governed. Therefore, the Declaration of Independence didn't emerge out of nowhere. Thomas Jefferson was not inventing something new. He was inheriting one. Ideas don't travel on their own. They travel with people. And this is where Ulster's story matters. Because during the 18th century, almost 250,000 people left Ulster for America. They were, in the main, Ulster Scots Presbyterians, like myself, with apologies to Arlene Foster. Those Ulster Scots Presbyterians, a people already shaped by a tradition of covenantal thinking, community governance, and a deep-seated suspicion of authority exercised without consent. They had lived that principle, and they had suffered for it as well. And when they crossed the Atlantic and settled the backcountry from Pennsylvania down through the Appalachians, they carried it with them. And these were not passive settlers. They were the revolutionaries. Several signatories of the Declaration had family roots in Ulster. The first edition of the Declaration was printed by John Dunlap, an Ulsterman from Strabane, and 17 of the men who would become President of the United States have Ulster Scots heritage. Today, more than 25 million Americans proudly claim that same ancestry. And these people did not simply come to America. They built it. And they built it on the ideas that came in no small part from here. And I think that is a remarkable inheritance and one that is worth celebrating. This spring, I had the privilege of hosting an event with the America 250 Commission in the US Senate in Washington. And what struck me most was the warmth that still exists for Northern Ireland. And every meeting that I had, I found Americans for whom Ulster is not a footnote in their history, but something that is part of their identity. They know this story. They feel it. The question for us is whether we tell it loudly enough ourselves. But I believe that we have every reason to do just that. This summer, Northern Ireland is hosting a series of events, concerts, exhibitions, theatre productions, and other experiences, all bringing this history to life for new audiences. And tonight is one of these events, and I want to congratulate Grand Lodge for their foresight and acknowledgement of this anniversary's importance. Significant numbers of Americans are already coming to trace their families' histories in the archives of the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, to visit the presidential homesteads and the churches that their ancestors left behind. And this autumn, for the first time in history, original documents from the time of the signing of the Declaration of Independence will leave the United States and go on public display here in Belfast. And this matters, not simply because of nostalgia, but because it's also an opportunity. Every American who comes to Belfast and beyond to find their roots is a visitor, a potential investor, a potential ambassador. And every story that we tell about this connection is a reminder that Northern Ireland is not a peripheral place. We stand at the origin point of one of the greatest democratic traditions in human history. 338 years ago, a revolution in these islands set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the world. 87 years later, across the Atlantic, men from Ulster helped bring that chain to its extraordinary finale. And so tonight, as we celebrate and commemorate that inheritance, let us commit to using it for the benefit of the people of Northern Ireland. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Minister Lyons. Our keynote speaker this evening is Lord Hannan. Lord Hannan read history at Oriel College, Oxford, before beginning a political career which would see him serve as a Conservative member of the European Parliament for South East England between 1999 and 2020. I'm not sure what happened in 2020, but you made yourself redundant largely. He's a prolific and prize-winning writer, and for many years has been a columnist for the Daily Telegraph. His insightful 2013 book, How We Invented Freedom and Why It Matters, won the Political Book Awards Polemic of the Year category. He's currently the director of the Institute of Economic Affairs. And in one of our first email exchanges, Lord Hannan said he didn't plan to speak too much or deal in great depth with the history of the Glorious Revolution in Ireland this evening, but I said that was fine and assured him that most of the audience had a fairly good working knowledge of events at Londonderry, Aughrim, Enniskillen and the Boyne. We do have Lord Hannan's agreement that he's happy to take some comments and questions at the end, so he's asked me to get you thinking as we go through this evening. If there's something that you'd like to raise or ask a pertinent question at the end. Lord Hannan, we're delighted that you've accepted our invitation to speak this evening, and we very much look forward to what you have to say this evening. Thank you.
Well, Grandmaster, thank you very much. Lord Lieutenant, Minister, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for having me here. I'd like you to imagine a long summer evening like this one. In Philadelphia, the light streaming in through those very tall windows in the old State House. It was a hot, sticky day. The people gathered in the room would have been aware of the heat as well as the significance of the moment. Their stockings would have been sticking to their calves. Beads of sweat would have been forming under their powdered wigs. And that light streaming in from the window would have illuminated on the table, yet unsigned, the Great Covenant. As we just heard the minister say, people of Ulster background would have been extremely familiar with the idea of contracts and covenants as the basis of a polity, of a political order. And what happened in that old State House in Philadelphia was a little secular miracle that has tangibly improved the lot of mankind on 5 continents. Put yourself back in the moment. It was John Hancock who signed first. Huge, great signature. To Hancock, now in the US, means to write your name in very large letters. He said, I'm writing it this way so that old King George won't need his spectacles to read it. And then the others followed one by one, including some people actually born in this damp, green, exquisite corner of the British Isles. A couple of the Pennsylvania delegates, James Smith and George Taylor, who had gone as first-generation migrants and who'd ended up there in the room adding their names. Many more who were of Ulster origin, although born in the US. Some of them very much carrying their family origins with them. One of the signatories from Delaware was called Thomas McKean. His father was a clergyman from County Antrim, and contemporaries said that McKean spoke in such a thick accent that they struggled to understand him, even though he'd been born and brought up in the colonies. I have some sympathy for them. He was from Ballymena. I spent a little bit of time actually campaigning with the irreplaceable Jim Allister in Ballymena in 2016, and we went to the county fair. And is there anybody here from the Ulster Scots Language Agency? Very good. You're doing God's work, I tell you. It is the most terse, wry, beautiful, and expressive form of English. But when those country people are code switching between Ulster English and Ulster Scots, I would put it to you that your speaker of only standard English would struggle to understand every word. But these were the people who were making the new republic. By 1775, some 200,000 people, what the Americans misleadingly and erroneously call Scots-Irish, had made the crossing. Probably 1 in 6 of the free white population of the colonies was of Ulster heritage. And what they did that day created the greatest republic in the world. And I really want to stress that point because it's a controversial claim right now. It's a very human thing to become blasé, to take things for granted, to kick against what we don't like in the existing order. But I'll tell you what, if we see the Anglo-American imperium of the last 200 or 300 years replaced by something else, we are very quickly going to miss what's gone. Right? When we talk about a country improving, we mean it's becoming more democratic, that it's elevating the individual above the collective, that its army doesn't regularly intervene in politics, that it becomes possible to change your leaders peacefully at the ballot box, that there's a culture of free speech, that newspapers are not censored. We are talking, in short, of countries becoming more like the Anglosphere, and especially that distilled form of it, which took shape exactly 250 years ago in Philadelphia, that turned a dream of freedom into a functioning nation state, and then planted the flag of that nation on the moon, that attracted tens of millions of settlers from every continent and every archipelago, drawn by an ideal that forged them not by blood and soil, but by a shared commitment to liberty. Now, I realize, as I say, that this is unfashionable. It's very, very easy to criticize aspects of US policy, especially under the current administration. And I should say, I'm also I have a regular column in the Washington Examiner, and I've used it at every election to criticize the current president. I think he disgraces the republic, and I think he debases his office. But let's not lose sight of the big picture of what it is that the US stands for. Yes, it has had its sordid moments, as which country hasn't, including our own. But you know, when revisionists and wokies talk about telling the story of a country, warts and all, I think it's quite important to get around to the and all part, right? Not just to dwell on the warts. And the and all part here includes defeating Nazism, defeating communism, and being a beacon of liberty for others. An imperfect country. Everything in this life is imperfect. But look at what some of the alternatives crowding in to take over are, and appreciate what we have. And by the way, even the fact that there is such a thing as anti-Americanism is a kind of backhanded compliment. Right? You never hear about anti-Armenianism or anti-Algerianism or anti-Albanianism because those are countries defined by place, by territory, by DNA. The fact that the US stands for an ideal, and I want to explore tonight what that ideal is and how, as you just heard from Gordon, how it came in large measure from here. That is in itself an extraordinary and, I think, underappreciated fact. But, you might say, why am I coming here to Belfast and celebrating what was an act of repudiation of British nationality? I mean, wasn't the whole essence of the American Revolution that they were throwing off their British identity? Didn't Paul Revere thunder through the townships of eastern Massachusetts shouting, "The British are coming"? Wasn't the Stars and Stripes banner raised in opposition to our country? Well, actually, no, almost none of that is true. Let's start with the Paul Revere story, because I think this is actually extremely telling in what it says about how the American Revolution has been reimagined. Think about it for a second, and you will realize that he cannot possibly have ridden through Arlington and Medford and so on shouting, "The British are coming," because the entire population of Massachusetts at that time was British. It had never occurred to them that they were anything else. I've met some eccentric people in Massachusetts. They vote in some pretty weird ways these days. But even in Massachusetts, you wouldn't go around shouting, "The British are coming," to a completely British population. Right? What he actually said was, "The regulars are out," or in one version, "The redcoats are out." This was a continuation in his mind of a very old dispute within British nationality, within the wider British polity. And nor, by the way, was the Betsy Ross flag seen at the time. The flag that was most commonly waved, first flew above the Continental Congress, it was raised on the first warship in the US Navy by John Paul Jones, was the Grand Union flag, which had the 13 stripes where they are now, but had the old Union flag, the pre-1800 English and Scottish Union flag, where the stars are today. And actually, in the display that I can see in the corridor there, you've got some earlier examples of flags, the Liberty and Union flag, the pre-Gadsden rattlesnake flag with the Union flag in the corner. And what does that tell us? It tells us a great deal about the motivation of the Patriot leaders. That these were not radicals. These were conservatives. These were people fighting for the freedoms that they believed they had been born with as Brits. As Lady Astor, the Virginia-born Lady Astor, put it, the American Revolution was made by Englishmen fighting for British ideals against a German king. The last bit I think was a bit unfair. George III, that dim and dutiful dullard, gloried in the name of Britain. We can perhaps forgive Lady Astor. She was writing in 1940 with Luftwaffe bombs falling all around her. So maybe we can overlook the anti-German quip. But the essence of the idea of defending old rights and liberties, rather than trying to create new ones in a vacuum, that was absolutely accurate. No one at the time would have understood the American Revolution as other than a civil war within a common polity. When you go to Lexington or Concord now and the tour guides say, well, the British were lined up over here and the Americans were lined up over here, no one at the time would have understood those terms. You need actually only look at the most basic primary source of all, never mind the resolutions of the Continental Congress or the letters that the Patriot leaders were writing to each other. Look at the Declaration of Independence when it lists its grievances against the king. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, right? Foreign mercenaries, i.e. not fellow Brits. And it was really only at that time that people began to see the contours of a possible national conflict. The use of foreign mercenaries for the crown, and then the involvement of France and other continental countries on the other side. Up until that moment, I don't think it would have occurred to anyone on either side that this was anything other than a continuation of the old Tory-Whig dispute that went back through the Glorious Revolution to the English Civil War. Now, I think it's probably okay, 250 years on, to admit that much of the American Revolution was based on a QAnon-level conspiracy theory, namely the idea that George III was trying to establish some medieval-type monarchical autocracy. Plainly, he didn't have it in him to do that. And for good measure, he was widely accused in the colonies of having a secret plan to impose Catholicism. He was the first Anglican king, the first Anglican king since either Charles I or Charles II, depending on how sincerely we take Charles II's professions of Anglican communion. But the point is that that weird conspiracy theory was equally prevalent among Whigs on this side of the Atlantic. It cut laterally across both sides of the Atlantic. And the first historian properly to have explored this in modern times was a man called Kevin Phillips, who was a Reagan official who in the 90s, disgusted by Clinton's Washington, withdrew to his farm in Connecticut and came up with a book called The Cousins' Wars, which looked at the way in which loyalties during the 1760s and 70s followed the old Civil War contours, the ley lines established in these islands. So in very broad terms, if your ancestors had been royalists in the 1640s, the chances are that you were going to be a loyalist in the 1770s. And if your ancestors had been parliamentarians in the 1640s, the chances are that you were going to be on the patriot side in the later contest. And this was equally true whichever side of the Atlantic you were on. So in North America, the hottest places for rebellion were the places that had been settled by Roundheads and their children, particularly New England. New England had been overwhelmingly peopled by people who came from East Anglia, the heartland of Cromwell's Eastern Association. That's why when they got there, they gave their towns names like Boston and Billericay and Hartford and Dedham. Right? Also, a number of people from this part of the British Isles had settled in Virginia and Pennsylvania. They were also pretty strong for the Revolution. In fact, when the British government tried to find recruits to fight in North America, it found that there was a widespread refusal, especially in England, to serve. 4 generals refused the commission before anyone took it on. And those who did eventually take it on, Burgoyne and Howe, were going through the motions. They were not prepared to fight the kind of brutal total war that would have been necessary to hold down a population in arms. One of the things that you will never hear stressed by anyone in the US is just how incredibly light the casualties were in those long years of war. According to the US Defense Department, fewer than 5,000 people were killed on the Patriot side in 7 years of war. Right? Compare that to what was happening in contemporary European conflicts. Right? Why? Because basically there was a lot of sympathy for the Patriot cause in Great Britain. People were not prepared to treat the rebels as other than their fellow countrymen, which is why the government ended up having to recruit heavily in the last places where people really did believe in royal authority, which were particularly Catholic Ireland and the Highlands of Scotland. Of course, that is something that is very troublesome now to a certain kind of American historian. The idea that Ireland divided along largely confessional lines in the 1770s, with Ulster Protestants drilling and forming militias in mimicry of their cousins in Pennsylvania, while the rest of the island was overwhelmingly for coercion and the crown. That is a deeply inconvenient fact for a certain kind of American politician now. And all sorts of people have tried to disguise it and muddy the waters. And of course, you can find individual Irish Catholics who were on there. There are exceptions to every rule, right? But it is, as a rule, the case. In fact, it was a very good thing for Ireland, because it was that, if you like, moment of loyalty to the crown that led to the beginning of the end of the penal laws and the integration of the population of the whole island with full civil rights. But in America itself, the only, I mean, when I was saying that the fighting was light, right? In general, the worst you had to fear, if the other side took your town and you'd been fighting the other way, whichever way round, in general, the worst you had to fear was house arrest. Usually not even that. Usually you were asked to give your parole. I say, you're not going to fight against us if we let you go, are we? Oh, no fear. Good man. Thanks for being so honest. You can go home now, right? That was why the casualty figures were so low. What was the exception? The exception were the Scots Highlanders who'd settled in the Carolinas and along the Hudson Valley. They did not want to live in a Protestant republic. They took this very seriously. And they fought so hard that Jefferson had to be made to take a specific attack on Scotland out of the first draft of the Declaration of Independence. Again, very strange from a modern perspective that Scotland in those days was the absolutist Tory right-wing place. But that was how it was seen in North America and in a lot of England. So all of these ties cut laterally. But what was it that the Patriot leaders were looking back to? When I say that they were conservatives and not radicals. Another way of putting that would be to say, let's look at the old meaning of the word revolution. The word revolution as it was understood in the 18th century. It still meant a revolution like the revolution of a wheel, a complete turning, right? A setting upright of that which had been placed on its head. A revolution was a kind of a restoration. And what was it that they wanted restored? Well, they traced the lineage right back to the folk right of Anglo-Saxon common law, Magna Carta, which was a very big deal. It formed the state seal of Massachusetts. It had been printed as early as 1687 in Pennsylvania. It was a really big deal for them. But above all, they looked back to the Glorious Revolution and to the Bill of Rights. Winston Churchill, when he wrote about it, said, "In the main, the revolution was a restatement of the principles which had animated the Whig struggle against the later Stuarts." Now, I should stress, by the way, that there are exceptions to everything, right? So when I gave that broad sense of, Eastern England and Southern England was more for the colonists, and Northern and Western England were more for the crown, and Highland Scotland was loyalist, and Lowland Scotland was patriot. There are exceptions to all those things. Do you know what I mean by that picture, Washington crossing the Delaware? Right? You will have all seen it, whether or not you register that that's what it's called. The one of him with the flag in the boat. Everything about that picture is wrong, but wrong in a quite telling way. Again, the French historian Ernest Renan said, being a nation is getting your history wrong. And how we get our history wrong is very telling. So, first of all, there's a lot wrong just logistically with that picture. As I've discussed, it wouldn't have been the Betsy Ross flag. It would have been one of these ones with the Union flag in the corner. Let's not even go to you couldn't stand up in a boat like that without toppling it over, right? And it would be destroyed by the ice flows and so on. Who is in the boat with him? A bunch of people, including a Scots Highlander with a Tam O'Shanter, a black man, and a Native American, right? The three categories of people that you are absolutely certain would have been on the other side. It's a very early example of identity politics, this, right? Nothing new is under the sun, as King Solomon tells us. Nothing new is under the sun. And the idea of making people feel included with a little bit of revisionist history, which we think is so characteristic of our own age, was obviously still happening whenever that was painted in the 1850s. But the looking back to the Bill of Rights, the Churchillian description, I think that's the most significant part of what it was that the Patriot leaders believed they were defending. And the simple proof of this is the way in which they immediately copied it into their own constitution. I mean, again, go to the most important of all the primary sources. Stop and ask the question, why was there a Bill of Rights at all in the US? Right? If you think about it, the US Constitution limits and circumscribes the powers of the government in general and the federal government in particular, right? And it says anything that is not expressly allowed in this document is not allowed. And rulers are limited, they don't have any powers except the ones that we are listing here, right? And then they immediately come along with 10 amendments in the form of the Bill of Rights saying, yeah, but here are some things that you're really, really, really not allowed to do. It's like, why? Surely that's kind of implied, isn't it? I mean, that's in the original version, right? Why did they have the Bill of Rights? Because they thought that that's what they had just come through the war for. And they thought that if they wanted to be a serious country and to uphold the principles which had animated the revolution, they needed their version of what had been the Bill of Rights in England, the Claim of Right, in Scotland. And they pretty much cut and pasted. I mean, they didn't have the capacity to do it on a computer, obviously, but they pretty much copied the clauses word for word. On the right to bear arms, on the freedom of the press, on the regular meetings of Parliament and the inability to impeach people for what they said in Parliament, on the prohibition of certain kinds of punishment, on the guarantee of jury trials. It was word for word. Let me quote what, here's one of the clauses of the 1689 Bill of Rights. Excessive bail ought not to be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. Okay? Now here is the US version, the Madison version. Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. You have to be remarkably blind not to see what the motivation was. Let's talk for a little bit about the process which made the Bill of Rights happen. And it played out differently in each part of the Anglosphere. It was easiest in England. There was the greatest consensus in England for the Glorious Revolution and for the settlement that followed. It's true, it is claimed, as Churchill's words there suggest, it was claimed as the ultimate Whig document, the ultimate Whig victory. But we can easily forget that it was made by the Tories. The Whig Party in 1688 had been completely destroyed. The 1685 election had seen it almost completely eliminated. Charles and then James had been manipulating the borough charters to remove Whig candidates. The Whig leadership was, well, the party had been almost literally decapitated. A lot of its leaders had been executed in 1683. The survivors were in exile with William in The Hague. Right? The Whigs were in no position to impose any kind of settlement in 1688. Yes, they were the main beneficiaries, and yes, loyalty to the Bill of Rights became the ultimate litmus test, the shibboleth for the Whig Party for as long as it existed until 1860. But it was delivered by the Tory Party. Seymour in the west of England, Danby in the north of England, they were the people who controlled the militias, had the majority in both houses, the majority on the bishop's bench. In England, it was very simple. There were very few people who didn't agree with the basic principles of parliamentary supremacy, the rule of law, an end to royal suspending power, and so on. Scotland, of course, different story. There was a Jacobite population in Scotland, and the eventual settlement had to be defended with force of arms and was challenged again twice militarily long afterwards. I have not come all this way to talk to you about Derry, Aughrim, Enniskillen, and the Boyne. This, of all hosting organisations, knows that story better than I do. But let's just say it was a more strongly contested settlement in this island than it was in Great Britain. But the story that is almost never told is the story of the Glorious Revolution in the colonies. They were small and sparse at that time, maybe 70,000 people clinging to these isolated seaboard settlements on the Atlantic. But they had their own glorious revolution. They had experienced James II as Duke of York. They'd experienced his attempt to remove the autonomy and the charters of the various colonies and to push them together into a royal dominion of New England. It was a plan carried out by a royalist Jerseyman called Sir Edmund Andros. And there had been a mini Glorious Revolution in the colonies. There were risings in Boston and New York. There was a general insurrection in Maryland aimed at breaking the power of the ruling dynasty, if you like, the planters. And at the end, in 1689, the states got their old charters back. That of Connecticut had been famously hidden in the bole of a white oak tree, the Charter Oak. So for them as well, the Glorious Revolution was very much a vivid part of their own history. This was not something that they were borrowing from across the Atlantic. It was part of the same story as a single people. It is true that it came to be differently understood in the decades that followed. That in the American colonies, the Bill of Rights was seen as almost like a proto-constitution, kind of above king and above parliament. Whereas in Great Britain, it was seen as the ultimate guarantor of parliamentary supremacy. And of course, in the 1760s and 1770s, that difference of interpretation was to have immense significance. Still, there's a reason we call it the Glorious Revolution. The trend in Europe at that time was towards authoritarian and autocratic government, moved towards what historians called enlightened despotism. England, Scotland, and Ireland could have very easily been caught up in that slipstream, but for what happened in 1688. The restoration of the rights of Parliament, but more than that, the restoration of the rights of the individual. Because once you took away the arbitrary power of the monarch, once you took away the monarch's power to suspend laws, to pardon people he liked, to interfere with due process, you had the beginnings of an inclusive rather than an extractive state. A country where it made sense to invest because no one with royal backing could confiscate your business. A country where contract was honored and contracts were arbitrated by independent magistrates who were free from political control. And that's why I think we can fairly say that it was 1689 that saw the breaking of the guild system, the beginning of free competition, the beginning of free trade, and the rise of the United Kingdom, or Great Britain and then the United Kingdom, to a level of wealth and prosperity that would previously have been unimaginable. I'm going to quote the great Whig historian Macaulay, because I think he puts it very well. He says, "The Declaration of Right, though it made nothing law which had not been law before, contained the germ of the law which gave religious freedom to the dissenter, of the law which secured the independence of the judges, of the law that limited the duration of parliaments, of the law that protected the liberty of the press, of the law that prohibited the slave trade, of the law that abolished the sacramental test, of the law that relieved the Roman Catholics from civil disabilities, of the law that reformed the representative system." He concludes, "The highest eulogy which can be pronounced on the revolution of 1688 is this, that it was our last revolution. The means of effecting every improvement which the Constitution requires may be found within the Constitution itself." I think that's pretty spot on. And it's why we have not needed anything new, and it's why the Americans were right to want to enshrine that. However, bizarre the idea that George III was bent on undoing it. Look, I want to leave lots of time for questions, but I want us to think about what it is in practice that then distinguishes the English-speaking countries from the rest of the world. The history that elevates and ennobles the Anglosphere. It's not some magical property in our soil or our skies or our water or our gene pool. It's the institutions that have their roots in what happened in 1689, the creation of, if you like, a crowned republic where ultimately popular sovereignty is guaranteed, the guarantee of freedom under the law, the guarantee of due process. And these things don't come naturally. They have to be taught. We're a tribal species. We're social primates, right? On some level, we are genetically predisposed towards authoritarian government. We like being told what to do. Think back to the lockdown, if you doubt me. And we like telling other people what to do. We like our neighbors being told what to do. So you need to teach liberty. People don't just stumble to this idea on their own. We're tribal. And that means that we're very prone to the idea that, if you like, outcome matters more than process. That if our guy wins, that's much more important than whether the rules were followed to the letter. This, I think, is what has distinguished our country, and the US in particular, from most of the rest of the world. I was born in Lima, Peru. I was brought up in South America. Peru is on its 12th constitution at the moment. But actually, that's pretty conservative by Latin American standards. The Dominican Republic, I think, is on its 48th, right? The US is still on its first. And the US is the outlier here because, in a way, the South American approach is much more natural for a race of social primates like us, right? We think that we're the good guys. We've got power. The last thing we want is to allow people that we regard as either stupid or malicious to take over, right? Even if they somehow con the voters into giving them the majority, right? It takes real self-discipline and understanding to elevate process above outcome, to be prepared to lose elections, and to obey the rules when that happens. I can see that under threat in the US, and I can see it under threat throughout the Western world. When I say we're attuned towards autocratic government, right? I mean, the extraordinary thing about any republic is just how counterintuitive the idea of picking someone is to a species like ours. Never mind our fairy stories, right? Think of our science fiction. Think of how we imagine putative futures. Star Wars or Dune or whatever. It's full of emperors and princesses and stuff, right? On some very deep level, we think this is the natural order. It's education, acculturation, that enables us to see that we're better off giving people choice and making the individual, rather than the group, the basic unit. Which leads on to something else. We need to be responsible citizens. The American experiment, the founders were very clear about this, depended on having people who were engaged and informed and therefore prepared to discharge their civic duties seriously. I think that is under fire in an age of screen addiction and shriveled attention spans. We're becoming increasingly post-literate, and I think you see that in all sorts of ways in which we want to have our cake and eat it in politics. We're anti every government at the moment. We're anti all politicians, right? You can get a round of applause anywhere by saying politicians are a bunch of cowards, they're useless, they're self-serving, da-da-da, right? Even if that's true, why are they that way? Right? In a democracy, don't we get the leaders we deserve? What incentives are we setting for the people that we elect? Right? If we are demanding a bunch of impossible things, if we want higher spending and tax cuts, if we want to support Ukraine but we don't want our energy bills to go up, if we want cheaper housing but no houses near us, if we want to support Greta Thunberg but we're really angry about the inflation, we are asking impossible things. Now, of course, we then rationalize that to ourselves by saying, oh, they're a bunch of crooks, they don't listen, they just don't get it. But there is some responsibility on us to look at trade-offs. How do we afford something? If we want to spend more on this, where are we going to get the money from, etc. Right? And I think that, where we really lost any sense of that was in 2020 with lockdown. 93% of us supported the first lockdown, and yet we now complain about all the consequences of it. The higher inflation, the higher taxes, the higher debt, the higher levels of school truancy, the collapse in productivity, the rise in antisocial behaviour, even the Boris wave of immigration. We all forget that in the summer of 2021, no one was coming back to work. It didn't just happen in a vacuum. Right now, I'm not saying it was a good thing. Plainly, it brought more problems than it solved. But let's not imagine that Boris just inflicted it on the country out of some sort of suicidal moment of wanting to lose elections. He was following the incentives set by an electorate that is not always completely rational about what it's asking for. And that, again, is a question of education, a question of teaching people basic civic responsibility. Devolved power. The reason that North America speaks English is because when the settlers arrived there, they brought with them a way of administering their affairs locally with dispersed and decentralized power that other polities of that age just did not recognize. Spain tried to run all of its possessions from the Escorial. Russia tried to run all of its possessions from the Hermitage. North America, we had benign neglect. People were free to elect their own mayors, their own sheriffs, to run their own affairs. We used to be really good at that in these islands. And we've lost, if you like, we need to re-import our revolution. We've lost in the mother country what has been preserved better in the colonies. One of the most depressing moments I had when I was still a Conservative politician was I was a big supporter of the idea of elected sheriffs, of having elected people to run the police force. We had this problem already visible 20 years ago of PCPCs, if you like, of cops who thought that their main job was to improve their relations with the LGBT to whatever community, rather than to, police crime and protect property. And I thought that the solution to this would be to have somebody to whom they had to answer who was elected. It didn't take off, it's about to be scrapped. But the most depressing conversation I had was when the then police minister said, "We like your idea, but we can't call them sheriffs, because we focus group tested that idea and people said it sounded much too American." I was like, where do you think they got the word from, for goodness sake? Right? And yet we've so lost touch with our own heritage, our own tradition of dispersed and devolved power, that I think we now need to bring it back home. And again, as well as it being dispersed and devolved, it needs to be democratic. We have empowered quangos and agencies in a way that would have enraged those American patriots of Ulster descent. They'd have called them crown placemen, and they'd have been right. By the way, I can't get used to Scots-Irish. It's inaccurate and annoying. And it, by the way, goes right back. When Washington had lost at Brandywine and Germantown, and he thought he was going to lose the whole thing, he said, "If defeated everywhere else, I will take my last stand for liberty among the Scots-Irish of my native Virginia." So it's a very old solecism, but that still doesn't make it correct. It's a really annoying and misleading term. If you had been one of those Ulster descended Americans, you would have immediately recognized the problem in today's country, which is that we have taken power away from elected representatives and put it in the hands of unelected officials. And we then complain when we don't like the results, but we balk at the only real solution, which is to give power back to the elected people. When I was elected, I was shocked by how easily I could get a round of applause out of any question time or any questions audience by saying about any subject, "This is too important to be a political football. Let's clear the politicians out of the picture and let the experts get on." What happens when the experts then turn out to be no good? What happens when you have the failures of procurement that we saw during the pandemic? What happens, to take a current example from my own part of the world, in Hampshire, when you have a police force that is so indoctrinated with anti-racism that when they come across the scene of a kerfuffle and they see a white man bleeding to death at their feet, their first instinct is to handcuff him because he's been accused of racism. Right? Something has gone, and if you were one of the people applauding the politicians who said, "Let the experts get on," that is your fault, right? We are only going to solve this when we take power back into the hands of elected people, which means taking it back into the hands of the rest of us. Keith Joseph used to say, if you give people more responsibility, they will behave more responsibly. That, it seems to me, is a pretty good summary of the American Revolution. I'm going to finish with one story. Another story involving a long summer day. This is August 1941, and it's the longest walk of FDR's presidency. President Roosevelt, in a way that nowadays is unimaginable, had the fact of his polio hidden from the electorate. And the entire media colluded in this. Every photograph of the president showed him seated or standing unaided. But that day he was going to meet Winston Churchill on the decks of HMS Prince of Wales. And he was determined literally to rise to the occasion. And so, defying his advisors, with his son on one side and a naval officer propping him up on the other, he made his slow, swaying way across the decks of HMS Prince of Wales while its band struck up the Stars and Stripes Forever. And what followed was the most perfect demonstration of what unites the English-speaking peoples. It happened to be a Sunday morning. And so the crews of the two warships, the USS Augusta and HMS Prince of Wales, were mustered together for a joint religious service. Churchill had chosen every detail personally and meticulously, down to the hymns, down to the reading that the chaplain gave from the pulpit on deck. It came from the book of Joshua. As I was with Moses, so will I be with thee. I will not fail thee nor forsake thee. Be strong and of good courage. And afterwards, Churchill burst out exultantly the same language, the same hymns, the same ideals. When he said the same ideals, this was not a bland generalization. This wasn't just a way of saying we're the good guys. Think of the world as it stood in August 1941. The entirety of the Eurasian landmass, from Brest and Lisbon to Vladivostok, was under one form or another of authoritarian government. Liberty was confined to the Anglosphere. What we now call universal values were in reality precepts that were developed almost exclusively in the language in which you are now listening to my words. And when we call them universal values, we're being polite. Imagine that the Second World War had ended differently. Imagine that the Cold War had ended differently. There had been nothing universal about them then. Habeas corpus, uncensored newspapers, jury trials, equality between men and women, regular elections, free speech, free assembly, free worship. If they became universal values, it was because the Anglosphere was prepared to deploy proportionate force in defense of freedom. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is our shared heritage. In Great Britain, in Northern Ireland, in the United States, and in every other great English-speaking democracy. And being heirs to that tradition carries with it a commensurate responsibility to keep intact the freedom that we have been privileged to inherit from our parents and to pass it on securely to our children. So never be afraid to stand for the ideals that elevated this province and that then created the world's greatest republic. And never be afraid to speak to and for the soul of the United Kingdom, of which, by good fortune and God's grace, we're privileged to be part.
About a week ago, I asked Lord Hannan did he have any PowerPoint slides he would like to use. It was a big mistake. He said his response was, if I can't command the audience's attention with my presentation, I'm not very good at my job as being a public speaker. I think we can all agree he's quite good at his job at being a public speaker. Now, we have probably 10, 12, 15 minutes. Lord Hannan's kindly said he will take some questions or comments from the floor. Colleen has a mic, so I'll hand over to you, and you can manage your own questions.
Thank you very much. Right, I'm handing over to Colleen. She can. You pick the next speakers, Colleen.
Thank you, Mr. Hannan. Lord Hannan, I was just wondering, in terms of the Reformed Protestant heritage within the United Kingdom, what was and its colonies, what was different about the Reformation that had in the UK that had the impact and promoted liberty?
Reading. If I had to put it in one word, the peculiar emphasis on wanting people to read the Gospels, which meant a much higher level of education, or at least a much higher level of literacy, let me put it more neutrally, which primed the population to do all sorts of things that would have been impossible in medieval times. It prepared us to move from an agrarian to a mercantile future. I mean, I could give you a whole lengthy, Weber-type argument, but that was the biggie. And which is why, Tocqueville, when he explored, he thought that Protestantism was a very key part of the US, right? He said, I see the whole future of this republic in the character of the first Puritan to land at Plymouth Rock. But he then goes on to say, an American Catholic is as libertarian as his Protestant neighbors because he's an American. He's saturated in that culture. And a French Protestant is every bit as statist as his Catholic neighbors because that's the culture in which he's grown up. In other words, it's not the doctrine or the dogma that shapes your ideology, it's the political culture, which may have, if you like, had the rocket fuel of that faith at some earlier point. But I don't think you need it now. I think you can come as a Korean American or whatever and buy in just as strongly to the libertarian, localist, and democratic ideals of the country.
Lord Hannan, thank you very much for your talk. I think it was absolutely fantastic. And you can hold an audience. Let's tell the truth. Civil and religious liberty for all is one of our watchwords. And obviously authoritarianism was greatly and possibly still is being threatened today. But during the 1930s, and you talked about the war, Winston Churchill said that the second liberation of Europe was based on 1688. Would you agree with that? And maybe would you suggest that we may need a third?
Yes. Okay. Well, the first bit, yes, I do. I'm now going to say something controversial, and I may lose all the audience at this point. But religious liberty has to apply to everybody, right? When people say, I'm all for free speech, but, and then they start adding all sorts of things that they happen to disagree with, they don't really believe in free speech. And I think the same is true of freedom of worship. And I'm thinking very specifically now of the row that we had 2 months ago about the iftar in Trafalgar Square. Either we're for religious liberty or we're not. If we're for it, then let's look at what happened. 13, 14 years ago, a bunch of British mosques got together and they launched a project called the Open Iftar, where they said, invite your non-Muslim neighbors to come and share the evening meal with you during the fast. Right? And this was, if you like, a particularly high-profile one of those. I reckon that celebrating special occasions in Trafalgar Square is a sign of deep assimilation, right? I think it's a very British thing to do, and we have all sorts of secular and religious organizations that use that space. If people are then dancing around trying to find some particular reason why this one doesn't count, then they don't really believe in religious liberty at all. And I happen also to think that they're making a grave tactical error, because if we want to isolate the extremists and the jihadis, we should not vindicate their central argument, which is that you can't be a practicing Muslim and a loyal Brit. The vast majority of people who were at that event in Trafalgar Square were simply celebrating a religious festival, it didn't occur to them that anyone would see it as a political statement. And when they hear British MPs, including a lot from my former party, making that argument, is that going to help assimilate them? Or is that going to drive them towards the extremists? So yeah, religious liberty for all, but really for all.
Thank you. Absolutely amazing. Loved it.
Brilliant question. Thank you. We've got time for one more, colleague.
Right. Thomas Paine, Rights of Man. How did his pamphlet influence, if at all, what happened in the revolution?
Well, I mean, it obviously did in the sense that it was widely published and he was widely quoted by a lot of Americans. I think he was a very dangerous and disagreeable man. And he ended up being in trouble with the law everywhere he went. You know, he went afterwards to France to support the revolution. He became a deputy. He was lucky to escape with his life, which was the story of Tom Paine wherever he went. Yes, fluent writer and powerful way with words, but fundamentally someone who knocked things down rather than trying to build them up. Now, I will give you a direct contemporary of his from the opposite end of the spectrum, who I think made a much better case for the American cause, which was Edmund Burke. They could not have been more different philosophically. Edmund Burke, I think, and these are two things which I really value. I do not bestow these titles lightly, and I don't trade in superlatives lightly either, but I think he was the greatest Whig, and I think he was the greatest Irishman. And there is not a day that I'm not directly or indirectly guided by his insights. He understood politics as cultivating the natural and the evolved and the organic over the planned and the imposed and the centralized. And he understood that the American Revolution was exactly a revolution in the sense of being a restoration of old liberties. The arguments he made in vindication of the Patriot case, he said, these are our people, but more than we are, because they are that much more bolshy, right? That much more ready to stand on their own 2 feet. And if they were prepared to accept the kind of terms that they're being offered by this ministry, then they wouldn't be Brits. Right? And I think that was a much more powerful and enduring argument. It's very rare that I get to talk about Burke on this island, so I'm going to say something specific about Burke as an Irishman. And I do mean as an Irishman, actually. A lot of people vaguely think that Burke was probably Anglo-Irish in some way. He really wasn't. I mean, he was a Burke, you know, like the Norman Irish, like the lady in red, Christa Burke. And he was at a hedge school. His mother was Catholic. His wife may have been Catholic. His headmaster was called O'Malley. I mean, he was very Irish in his view of the world, his understanding of things. And I think this gave him 2 insights that none of his English contemporaries had at the time when the French Revolution began. First, the idea that almost every English Whig, in fact, almost every Englishman had, it can't happen here. Well, if here was Ireland of the late 18th century, you had a much more realistic idea of what might happen, right? And of the fragility of social structures. Second, he saw something else, which is that if the main enemy of Britain was no longer a Catholic French monarchy, but was now an anti-Catholic French republic, that the whole essence of the penal laws was redundant, and that the door would be open to a reintegration of the Catholic population. He lived just long enough to see it, the beginning of the end of the penal laws at the end of the 1790s. And I think those were insights he would not have had, but for coming from Dublin. I mention that only because I think they exactly demonstrate his kind of conservatism. Go with what works. If you're in an unfamiliar situation, trust what he called the wisdom of your ancestors, right? 1 million people have been here before. They've worked out what to do. Don't try and think through every unencountered problem from first principles. Honor the customs of your tribe, right? It sounds almost anti-intellectual when you say it like that. And yet we all know that it is the supreme principle on which you should run a successful country. See my editor friend. Very good.
Yes, hello.
How are you? Nice to see you.
It was a wonderful talk, and I was thinking just when I first saw your dates that the paper that I edit is the midpoint in those dates is 1732, or 1737. I could ask you lots about that time and the Ulster people, but that's maybe too complicated. One of the things that I found with unionists, and I've been thinking about this a lot over the last 19 years. It's 19 years ago I joined. The one thing you'll never get is a unionist who says that they're Irish, full stop. But what you will always get, almost always, is unionists who accept a qualification of Irish. Protestant Irish, Anglo-Irish, British Irish, Northern Irish. And I must say I rather like Scots Irish for umpteen reasons. Why are you, I know you're talking historically, but maybe just touch a little bit more why you're so averse to it.
Well, I mean, I think it is inaccurate. I also think it's opened the door to a lot of people in North America who are of basically Ulster Protestant descent being attracted by the meme-like power of Irish republicanism because they've started thinking of themselves as Irish in a different way. Mistakes matter. But what you say, I'm sure, is true, and you know the province better than anyone. But go back a little bit in time, and you'll find lots of unionists who called themselves Irish without qualifications. In fact, you could argue that there was a time when the central claim of unionism was that to be Irish was to be British. And I mention this only because I think maybe this is, forgive me if this is an obvious point, it's not one I've heard made before, but I think when we have, if you like, these identitarian arguments, or specifically when you guys here do, it gives unionism a fundamental advantage that is hugely overlooked, which is that I do not see any version of Irish republicanism that is not on some level based on a rejection of British identity. It's defined in some way by the things that make it different, right? Fine. Whereas, as I say, the old traditional elemental claim of unionism is that there was no conflict. There didn't need to be, that it was all the same identity. And I think in a pluralist society, whatever the constitutional settlement was in these islands, some people are not going to be happy with it, right? However it was done, wherever there was a border, if there was no border at all, whatever, some people are going to be unhappy. But people are going to be less unhappy if the tradition is a fundamentally pluralist one whose identity is based on accepting everyone else. And see, for all the claims of the people now saying we should have all these congresses and look at how to integrate, I don't see any willingness to move on the fundamental point of acknowledging a British identity for people on this island. So, yes, there's a readiness to make all sorts of concessions to kind of misguided Irish Protestants and folk customs and so on. But constitutional links to the Crown, which would seem to me the most basic expression of Britishness, at every stage has been rejected. You know, it was rejected in the constitutional changes in 1938, rejected in the language laws, rejected in the foreign policy, in the war. At every stage, people have preferred to emphasize distance rather than to try and reach out. And when you ask people now in the Republic, in opinion polls, would you be in favor of a united Ireland if it meant changing the flag, if it meant having some role for the Crown? People always say no, which is absolutely fine. I mean, people are sovereign, they're allowed to make their own decision. I've got no issue with that. But it seems to me that in any kind of border poll situation, that would give a significant and underexplored advantage to the pro-UK side.
Thank you, Lord Hannan, for your generosity of time for questions. Before we close, I'd just like to take an opportunity to let you know that another part of this America 250 project that the institution is involved in will see the publication of a new book examining the relationship between the Glorious Revolution and the Declaration of Independence. It's currently being researched and compiled and designed and typeset as we speak by Dr. Jonathan Madison, my colleague, and Mark Thompson, who I'm glad is with us this evening, and it will simply be entitled 1776-1688 Declarations of Liberty. Again, it's been made possible with funding from the Department for Communities. And subjects examined include an overview of the circumstances which led to the Glorious Revolution, including the oppressive regime of James II, the necessity for political and social liberation, as well as historic changes which were introduced following the accession of William and Mary. The content then focuses on the establishment of British colonies in America and the legacy of the Glorious Revolution there, which we've touched on, before turning its attention to the motivations of those whose subsequent actions would culminate in the Declaration of Independence. The book's main focus, it's important to say, is not on the military campaigns of both eras. Rather, it seeks to highlight the many commonalities of the rebels of 1688 and those of 1776 in their pursuit of liberty and their rights as British citizens. We hope that copies will be available next month from Schomburg House and selected distributors, and we plan to have an informal launch event in the summertime, so if you keep an eye out on our social media channels for further details of the book's release. I'd now like to ask our Most Worshipful Grand Master, Harold Henning, to say a few words of thanks and close, after which everyone's very welcome to stay for refreshments, which will be served at the rear of the room. Thank you.
Lord Lieutenant, Deputy Lieutenant, my lords, ladies, gentlemen, Minister, distinguished guests, friends all. As Grand Master of the Grand Orange Lodge of Ireland, that all-island body, it is my pleasant duty to say a few words of thanks on behalf of all who made this event possible. Firstly, to the staff here at Riddel Hall for their assistance in hosting our event and providing the refreshments. An absolutely fantastic venue. To Iain and Meban for looking after our audio-visual setup. We hope to make this evening lecture available on our YouTube in coming days. To Graham, our photographer, keeping an eye on our social media and the Orange Standard, due out next Monday for coverage of this event. Our thanks also to the members of Ballygowan Flute Band, who entertained us so well earlier and will do so again shortly. One of our premier concert and marching bands who are proud to have associated with our Orange institution and indeed are proudly associated with our own Orange Lodge. Thanks to the Ulster Scots Agency for supplying their Declaration of Independence exhibition. Please take the opportunity, as Lord Hannan has said, to have a look at it before you leave this evening. Can I say thanks to our own staff members, you know who they are out there, for organising this evening and ensuring that it has been a success. To our funders, the Department of Communities for the generous sponsorship, and in particular to Minister Lyons for taking time out of his busy schedule to be present and speak tonight. Finally, a special word of thanks to our keynote speaker, Lord Hannan. We very much appreciate your attendance here this evening, sir, and engaging with us and an entertaining programme and presentation. And I want you now to come forward just to present you with two small gifts on behalf of the organisers.
Wow.
There's your Northern Ireland tie,
Amazing.
which I hope you'll wear with pride.
Great. Yes.
And I know you weren't talking to us tonight about 1688, 1690, but
yes.
that's a wee
Amazing.
insight into us
Thank you
beyond the
very
banner. So
Lovely.
enjoy reading.
Thank you very
Thank you
much.
very much. And before I conclude, can I say a special word of appreciation to our esteemed brother, Lord Rogan, for all his work behind the scenes in making the necessary arrangements with Lord Hannan and acting as his personal chauffeur and making this visit to this part of His Majesty's kingdom so special. And I know, Lord Hannan, tomorrow you're going on a tour around our capital city of Belfast. I'm sure the Lord Lieutenant will be delighted with that. And maybe, if you get a wee while, you could end up at the top of the Craigie Road at a wee museum and a bit of history talk up there. Dennis, as ever, we appreciate all that you continue to do for our institution. If I have omitted anyone, it has not been intentional, and please accept my apologies. But I just want to say a special word of thanks to all you who have come along here this evening. We did comment earlier, a lovely evening like that, you could have been out at the barbecue, you could be out in the garden, you could be out doing other things. But you give of your time to come here tonight on this special occasion, and for that we are deeply appreciative. Just before we enjoy refreshments provided, can I ask our brother, the Reverend Dr. Ron Johnson, just to say thanks for the provisions provided. Ron.
Let us all pray. Our Father, we thank you for the privilege of being here tonight. We think in Scripture how God commanded the Israelites again and again, you shall remember, you shall remember, you shall remember. And we thank you for the glorious past. We've learnt tonight again of the wonderful privileges of the past, that we need to know where we came from, to know who we are, to know how we ought to behave and act in these days. And we do praise thee and thank thee that in thy providence and grace that we enjoy liberties, and indeed all in our citizens of our nation and in the United States enjoy liberties that many citizens around the world can but envy. And Lord, we're conscious that freedom isn't free, it costs. We're reminded by Lord Hannan of even the Second World War and the great sacrifice. Lord, may we be determined to do what we ought to do to preserve such liberties. We thank you now for these good things that have been provided. May we eat and drink to your glory, remembering those that are in great need, and then take us to our homes in safety. We pray the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God the Father, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit may rest, remain, and abide upon you and all whom you love, both now and forever. Amen.